It's a boy. The Baron has a son. It was the evening of August 21st, 1567, and this was the glad news, went about the castle while the Baron and Madame de Boissy were smiling happily over my birth as their first child. My father thought of my future, being the newest owner of the castle of a famous family. I would have the title of de Sales, following a long line of my noble ancestors. But my young mother, although she shared my father's happiness to the full, was not dreaming of the future at all. She was thinking of the day, a few months ago, when they knelt together in the church of Our Lady of Joy at Annecy. They were praying for a son, and my mother had promised him to God, hoping that God would choose him for one of his priests. My castle, Sales' prominent house, it had a majestic mountain for its near neighbor, and it looked down through a beautiful valley to the little town of Thorens, 12 miles from Annecy. It is so beautiful and charming that my father, M. de Boissy, could forget all his high-sounding titles and successful military career here. Though he wants to live in peace and farm the land, the Duke of Savoy appointed him a justice of the peace. He thought so highly of my father, that he didn't want him to retire from public life altogether. It is no easy task to keep the peace here in these days. Religion is a much discussed subject, and Geneva, which is quite near, is only too keen to spread Protestantism. Where gentle persuasion don't work, hired thugs are brought in. And the ordinary folk are only too easy to be persecuted. This does work with my father. He stands loyal to his religion and his ruler. When anyone brings up the subject of Calvinism, his only answer is, "Look here. I'm 12 years older than this religion. I'll have nothing to do with it." To show his firm faith, as well as his happiness at my birth, my father marked my baptism day with a dawn-to-dusk distribution of charity. As the time came me to be taken to church, a large crowd, rich and poor, gentry and peasants, accompanied us. They all knew that there was no doubt about Francis Bonaventure de Sales. I hadn't received my father's title, but I had been given my father's faith. I was a Catholic. I was a premature baby and very delicate at first, but my mother looked after me well. So I became a sturdy lad, energetic and wide awake. When I strolled through the de Sales property with my mother, or on our visits to the poor houses in the village, I always asked questions. I especially asked my mother to tell about God, and about His loving presence and His great love. Once we returned back home, we turned very easily and naturally to prayer, on the terrace of the castle, with the setting sun bathing the beautiful mountain behind us. I think, very soon, I was deeply penetrated by God's presence. This was shown by what happened one evening. My father noticed that I am afraid of the dark. Now, according to him, no man should show fear, so he ordered me to go out into the night. I paused a moment on the doorstep, and then threw myself forward bravely into the darkness, shouting out, "My God, you are there! My God, you are always there!" And so I conquered my dread of the dark. I was just only 5 years old, when my father thought the time has come to get me ready for the career of a gentleman, the career which a proud father has planned for me. Because of my delicate health, up to now, I have been brought up rather daintily. Now, I have to be hardened. So, summer and winter, he have to go out with my father, joining him in hard riders through the forest, hunting, and sleeping at night in an unheated room. And it must be remembered that very often in Savoy the temperature drops to 20 degrees below freezing. But this hard life didn't frighten me. At all times, I was ready to join with the village children in their tough games in the fields or woods. When the weather was too bad, we played along the stone staircases and corridors of the castle, hide and seek, jumping, wrestling. I was the ringleader. Though my father was proud of me, this frightened sometimes my more tender mother. Although I was so full of fun and games, I found it easy to study. I was lucky to have the chaplain of the castle to teach me, a devoted priest, though a little gloomy, a good man. Under his guidance I worked with a will. My favorite subject was the religious lesson. I repeated often and afterwards to my village friends, making them say it over and over until they knew it. Then I gathered them round me in a little chapel nearby, and teach them to pray. Don't think that with all this I was an angel. One day I was going past the kitchen, which was out of bounds, and and smelt cakes cooking. I opened the door, peeped in, and saw the cook just fetching some delicious cakes out of the oven. I came forward with my hand out, and the cook, thinking to teach me a lesson, pressed a hot cake firmly into my hand. Too proud to show pain, I blinked back my tears and went off to my mother, to beg her pardon, and a bandage. On another occasion a silk cord caught my eye. One of the workers had left it there while doing a job in the castle. I took it. When the theft was discovered, I went myself to my father, told him what I had done, knelt down and asked him to forgive me. But, my father sent for the cane and in front of all the servants gave me a good thrashing. I learned my lesson. A few hours later, the father found me on my own, very quiet and thoughtful. "Francis, what's in your mind?" "Well, father, after your advice, I've made up my mind to be good in future." I was no more than 7 when I went to stay with a family of friends at La Roche, and together with my 3 cousins started school there. I got on well, both with my teachers and my schoolmates, but I could still get into trouble, whenever my good nature led me to extremes. I once tried to save my cousin from a well-deserved caning, but all I managed to do was to annoy the teacher, who beat us both. Yet I was now beginning to think of others, wanting to share their troubles, and trying not to cause them trouble. I would like to explain what I did one day while we were out shopping. We had bought a pair of gloves for me, and the servant had haggled so hard and so long over the price that in the end the shopkeeper let me have the gloves much cheaper, but told me that it was daylight robbery, ruining his business. I asked back, just afterwards, "How much did you lose on the deal, sir?" And I fetched out my own little purse to make up the difference. There were different sides to my character, one wholehearted, as shown by my enthusiasm, "When I grow up I shall wage war on all heretics." For I heard my teacher talking about David and Goliath and about religious wars. Then, my quick and lively nature soon had my friends organized into a procession, marching through the town, yelling hymns. On the other hand, my quick and lively temper couldn't stand the slightest opposition. I showed that I was put out, the blood would rush to my face, and I had a hard job to keep my temper. I was 10 when I made my first Holy Communion, very young for those days, and on the same day, December 17, 1577, I was also confirmed. I made 2 resolutions: I would visit the Blessed Sacrament every day of my life, and I would try to learn from the saints. It was about this time that I began to think seriously about becoming a priest. By the time I was 11, I was asking for the tonsure. In those days the tonsure was given very early. I told my mother first, and she was delighted. Perhaps this was God claiming his part of the bargain she had made with him. She would certainly put in a good word for me with my father. My father, however, saw nothing to get excited about. It was a nice idea, but probably no more than a passing fancy. But he did give his consent and I was tonsured. There was nothing outwardly to show that this was anything more than a passing fancy. I still wore the clothes and the sword of a young noble. But from now on my inner ambition and my hopes were to grow more and more apart from my father's plans. My father could only think of making me an accomplished gentleman, and for that, Paris was the place. So when I was 15 I was sent off to this great city, noisy, bustling and violent in its contrasts of good and evil. I would be away for 6 years, not coming home even for holidays. In all that time, in that city, would I be able to keep my vocation? Fortunately for me, I was not alone. Father Diage, my staunch but rather severe friend, agreed to come with me. My father himself drew up the program for me. I was to study rhetoric and philosophy, but I must also take lessons in fencing, dancing and horse riding, and acquire all the arts and graces which would fit me for a career at court. I was very conscious of the fact that I was now a cleric. Most of this would not be of much use to me. But I set myself to obey my father and tried hard to fit in with his wishes. But once I had done this, I felt that my free time was my own. It wouldn't be disobedience if I prepared myself for the priesthood in my spare time. This is not to say, though, that I didn't enjoy myself at Paris. I joined in the students' parties and university rags, showing myself a good friend and a pleasant companion. But for the most part, I preferred to use my leisure moments for prayer and the study of theology. A good time was all very well, but I wanted to be a saint. The 6 years of study went very quickly, and I took my degree in arts in 1588. My father's plan was that I should now go on and qualify in law. But civil war was just breaking out in Paris. Henry III of France, and the future Henry IV, who was not yet a Catholic, and Henry de Guise, the leader of the Catholic League, were all getting ready for a great religious struggle. It would be hard to study there. Father Thadews wrote to my father for instructions. The reply told us to come home. I was delighted. I would see my 3 little brothers, all born while I was away at Paris. And it might now be easier for me to become a priest. Cutting short my studies would put a stop to my father's ambitions. I was soon disappointed. Padua was as good as Paris, and my father decided to send me there. So, very soon afterwards, we were on the road again, this time to Italy. I took with me one of my brothers, who, it was planned, would become a priest while I was to study law. I settled down to study once again. After all, I thought, a good knowledge of law would be useful to a priest, and I could always study theology in my spare time, as I had done at Paris. I wasn't so popular here. Some of the other undergraduates thought I worked too hard and showed them up. I was a noble, too, and therefore a snob. To teach me a lesson, as they thought, they waylaid me one night, with drawn swords. They got a shock. Although I was outnumbered by 4 to 1, I turned on them, drew my own sword and put them all to flight. Smarting under their defeat, they drew up other plans. So, one day, I was invited to the home of one of the professors. Thinking it was a straight invitation, I went along, not suspecting anything. When I got there, I was met by someone who said that she was the professor's wife. But as soon as they got into conversation, I discovered that she was no such thing. She was a woman of bad character. I bowed to her and lost no time in getting away. Once again I fell ill. Nobody knew what was the matter. 3 doctors all gave different verdicts of fever, the climate, overwork, but they all agreed on one thing: I was very seriously ill. My chaplain, Father Thadews, was reduced to panic. If I am dead, how could Father Thadews face my parents? But I myself was quite calm. Whatever God want, His will be done. I had only one wish left. If I did die, I wanted to donate my body to my fellow undergraduates in the medical faculty. I was glad to do them this service, as they found it very hard to get bodies for dissection.
Strangely enough, I got better, and calmly went on with my studies. 3 years went by, and on September 5, 1591, I took my doctorate of law. I was so brilliant that the examiners asked if they might publish the results themselves, and they informed my father that his son was an outstanding lawyer, with a splendid legal future before him. It seemed that my father's dreams were coming true at last. Before leaving Padua, I had one more thing to do. With my tongue in my cheek, I asked my chaplain, "May I go and thank the lady who helped me so much in Padua? I should like to, before we leave." Father Thadews, who was always a little on the strict side, allowed me to go, but insisted on going with me. "It's my duty," he said. "I must find out just who is this lady friend of me." He was very annoyed to find that Francis had been pulling his leg, and that the lady was none other than Mother Mary. I was so annoyed that I thought I had better reassert my authority, and I soon got a chance to do so. We were coming back by boat. While we were strolling on deck, a sudden gust of wind blew my hat away. In those days, it was very bad manners for a nobleman not to wear a hat, so I had to make do with a nightcap, until they could land and buy one. But each time we docked, Father Thadews, who held all our money, somehow forgot to buy me a hat. For the rest of their voyage I had to wear my makeshift hat, to the great amusement of all the crew, although I saw the funny side of it as well. We got back home to find that my family had moved to a house near the lake of Annecy. The reason for the move came as an unpleasant surprise. The Protestants were more active lately and had been making raids into the surrounding country. The new house was safer and farther away from Geneva. There was another shock waiting for me. My mother had to be led to me by a servant, she had become blind. My father was bubbling over with pride and happiness, and took me aside to show me the wonderful collection of law books he had got ready for me. Very soon, my father began to show off his son to all the neighbors, and at the end of a great ceremonious banquet, he gave me the title of Baron of Valerigit. Without having been asked, without any desire on my part, I now found that I had become a prominent layman of Savoy, one of its nobles, and a candidate for the Senate. My father went even farther than that. I was now of an age to marry, even though I didn't seem to be in any great hurry. That didn't matter, for my father had made all the arrangements for my. When he told me of this, I didn't appear at all enthusiastic. I went with my father, however, to see the young lady who had been chosen for me. I was polite and courteous to her, but no more than that. And on the way back, all I would say was, "That girl is too good for me, she deserves a better husband." My real reason, of course, was quite different, but it was still my secret. I wasn't ready yet to tell my father. First I wanted to talk to my mother and ensure her help. I was due for a disappointment, however. My mother seemed to have swung round to my father's point of view. I was their eldest son. Normally the oldest should carry on the family line. In any case, my younger brother was going to be a priest. I had to swallow my disappointment and start the round of social and courtesy calls that my rank and position demanded. I called first on the exiled Bishop of Geneva, Monsignor Granier, now living in Annecy. As it happened, he was presiding over an examination of some of the young priests, so he asked me to join him there. During the examination, a difficult point came up for discussion, and several solutions were put forward. I was asked for his opinion, and surprised everybody by a very sound answer which convinced them all. I continued my round of courtesy visits, and when they were over I applied to become a lawyer, my father's next step for me. At Chambéry, after a brilliant examination, I was unanimously admitted to the bar. A few days later, the full session of the Senate of Savoy appointed me clerk to the Senate. All the senators gathered round me to wish me well and to congratulate me on my speech. But my heart was not in it, and on the way home I kept asking myself whether this was the way my life should go. While we were riding along, my horse threw me. Blushing at my bad horsemanship, I picked myself up. And when I picked up my sword and scabbard, I noticed they had fallen in the form of a cross. When it happened again, a little further on, Father Thadews became impatient. I said nothing, but he was even more surprised. But, when I was thrown from my horse again and the sword and scabbard formed a cross for the third time, even Father Thadews realized that this was more than just falling off a horse. This time, he said nothing. I now realized that God had given me an answer sooner than I expected. When I got home, I told my cousin, Louis de Sales, who was a canon of the cathedral. Together we approached my mother, and this time she was very easily won over. We weren't sure yet how to tackle my father, but we were sure God would show us how to get my father's consent. Meanwhile, we had a cassock made ready for me. It so happened that the provost of the cathedral chapter had just died. Louis de Sales was in charge of the nomination papers for the new provost. He suggested that the only way to get my father to agree that I should become a priest was to offer this high dignity, second only to the bishopric, to his oldest son. The papers came back from Rome in May. Francis de Sales was named as the new provost. When Louis showed my father the papers, there was a moment's hesitation, and then, generously, the father abandoned all his fine plans. The very next morning, my ruffles, lace and sword all put away, I put on my cassock for the first time. Then, as quickly as I could, I went to a solicitor's office to give up and hand over my position as eldest son and my title of Baron of Valerigit. While waiting to be ordained priest, I was once told by my bishop to preach in the cathedral. The bishop not only authorized me to do this, but insisted on coming to hear my first sermon. Just before the sermon, I had a sudden attack of nervousness. I could hardly stand, scarcely speak. My bishop encouraged me and sent me up to the pulpit. I began, very slowly and simply I talked to the people about the faith. All were spellbound. Afterwards, 3 Calvinists came along and asked to be received into the church. On December 18, 1593, I was ordained. I was 26 and a priest at last. Some of the friends of the family thought I might still like to have the title of senator. When they came to offer it to me, however, I told them I wanted only to be a priest, that was all. Nevertheless, they brought me the title. I didn't even bother to read it, but took it back to the court office and told them to put it in the archives. When, however, it came to the office of provost, there was no delay. I took charge straight away and told the other canons, my fellow soldiers, I called them, that my aim was to win back Geneva to the faith. I was no longer the boy who dreamed of fighting heretics. I could now tell them, heresy comes from unworthy priests and from bad Catholics. It will only disappear when the scandals are removed. Our assault on Geneva must be made by prayer and the good example of our own lives. I quickly singled out the keenest of the genial laymen and formed us into the Confraternity of the Holy Cross. We promised to go in procession several times a year, in order to show our faith to others and to do penance for ourselves. It wasn't an easy promise, because the procession went barefoot, in sackcloth and black hoods, right through the town. It was our second promise, though, which really woke up the town. For, the next day and ever after, as soon as the Angelus bell rang out, they took off their hats, got down on their knees, no matter where they were, and said the Angelus. I was never able to turn down an invitation to preach. In fact, one day my father complained to me, "You're preaching too much." Even on weekdays, when the bell rings and I ask, "Who is preaching this time?" it's always, the provost, of course. In my younger days, we had quality, not quantity. Why, I heard more eloquence, more Latin and Greek quoted in one of those sermons than in a dozen of yours. I only smiled. I'm not trying to be eloquent. All I want to do is to help people love God, and that's best done by talking lovingly and simply to them. I was right, and the ordinary folk proved it. They flocked to my sermons and crowded round my confessional. There were always the odd gossips, of course, jealous of my success and suspicious of my methods. Up to now, the bishop thought of me as his son. But with these troublemakers whispering in his ear, the bishop began to turn against me, little by little. I noticed the change and grieved at it, but went on as though nothing had happened. When the bishop discovered his mistake and was ready to punish the mischief makers, it was I myself who asked him to forget the whole business. Shortly afterwards, the Duke of Savoy appealed for missionaries. The district of the Chablais had just been handed back to him, after it had been in the power of Geneva for more than 50 years. It was officially Catholic, but after 50 years' indoctrination there remained only about 100 Catholics out of a population of 30,000. Besides, there had grown up a deep hatred and a widespread mistrust of all things Catholic, and the ministers sent out from Geneva were defying the Duke's authority and refusing to leave. It would not be easy. The bishop was at his wit's end, unsure of what to do and how to do it. When my father came to hear of this, it didn't strike him at all as an ideal solution. It was one thing to be a priest in the peaceful town of Annecy, quite another in a hostile and hate-filled area like the Chablais. He dashed over to Annecy, tried to argue me out of it, and pleaded with the bishop to change my mind. The bishop felt so sorry for the old man that he nearly gave in. "Hold fast, my lord," I begged. The poor father went back home, disappointed and angry, and refusing to bless his son. I began with a day of prayer and fasting then, September 23, 1594, I set out. My cousin, Canon Louis de Sales, begged to be allowed to go with me. We went off together, on foot, carting our own luggage, saying the rosary as we went. There was only one safe place to make for, the Duke's garrison at the fort of Allings. Else here, with churches in ruins, with the wayside crosses tumbled down, and with every man's hand against them, we could only appear in daylight. At night, the only sensible thing was to return to the fort. Luckily, the biggest town in the area, though none, was only a few miles away. We could begin our campaign there. For years past there had been no priest here, with the result that out of 3,000 people there were only about a dozen Catholics, mostly outsiders. The next Sunday, I called these few together and led them into the church, long since used as a Calvinist church. We had taken the Calvinists by surprise. But when we came out, the Protestants had got over their surprise, and a very hostile reception awaited us. Returning to the fort at Allings, we found a manservant and horses ready for us. My father had guessed what would happen, thinking we would be extremely discouraged. He had sent horses to bring us home. He couldn't have been more wrong. I was not at all discouraged. We had made a good start. So I sent back the horses and my cousin, Louis, with them. Louis was to thank my father, let him know that all went well, and tell him that a de Sales didn't give up quite so easily.